Former DEA agent Joseph Bongiovanni could spend up to 20 years in federal prison after a jury convicted him today on 7 of the 11 charges against him.
Number 1. Joseph Bongiovanni. It started with whispers, rumors that a veteran DEA agent in Buffalo, New York, might be working for the very people he was sworn to bring down. For years, those whispers went nowhere. But by the time investigators followed the trail, it led to one of the most shocking betrayals of law enforcement trust in recent memory. Joseph Bongiovanni wasn't a rookie or a rogue. He was a seasoned federal agent with over 2 decades of service. To his peers, he was solid, a career professional who had worked narcotics cases across Western New York. Born and raised in the Buffalo area, he had deep community ties. His name carried weight in local law enforcement circles, and to those who knew him, he seemed to represent the badge itself. Steady, experienced, and incorruptible. But behind that image, a very different story was quietly unfolding. For over 10 years, according to federal prosecutors, Bongiovanni was cultivating dangerous connections. His contacts weren't informants, they were allies. Members of drug trafficking groups, people tied to the Buffalo Mafia and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, were not just on his radar. And as investigators would later allege, he was protecting them. It began with small favors, a name tipped off here, a case delayed there. But over time, the favors turned into a full-scale betrayal of duty. Bongiovanni allegedly accepted at least $250,000 in bribes from traffickers and organized crime figures, helping them avoid detection and prosecution. The bribes came in various forms: cash payments, favors, and even cover-ups. When the DEA was preparing operations, he would reportedly tip off his contacts, letting them know when and where not to be. He falsified reports, closed cases prematurely, and steered internal investigations away from key suspects. Each time, he made sure the paperwork looked clean. Each time, he left just enough ambiguity to keep suspicion at bay. And for years, it worked. The first real crack came when agents outside his circle began to notice odd inconsistencies in his files. Reports didn't line up with evidence logs. Informants he claimed to have met didn't exist. Certain names kept disappearing from ongoing investigations without explanation. By 2018, internal auditors flagged enough anomalies that the Department of Justice quietly launched a deeper probe. This wasn't a routine check. It was a covert operation aimed at one of their own. What they uncovered was staggering. Wire transfers, cash deposits, and coded communications painted a picture of a man deeply entangled with the people he was meant to pursue. Federal investigators alleged that he was not only leaking information, but actively obstructing cases against high-level traffickers connected to both the Buffalo Mafia and the Outlaws Motorcycle Club. For law enforcement in Western New York, it was a gut punch. The idea that a DEA agent, someone sworn to enforce federal drug laws, could be operating as an insider for criminal networks was almost unthinkable. In November 2019, the FBI arrested Bongiovanni. The charges were sweeping: conspiracy to obstruct justice, bribery, and falsification of official documents, among others. The case shocked the DEA and cast a long shadow over the Buffalo field office. At trial, the prosecution laid out years of evidence, records, testimony, and secret communications that, they said, proved Bongiovanni had been selling out the badge for cash and loyalty. They described how he built a double life: lawman by day, protector of traffickers by night. The defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Bongiovanni's relationships were informal, part of a long-standing network of street contacts and confidential sources, not evidence of corruption. They claimed he was being scapegoated for a messy web of internal politics and misunderstood alliances. But jurors didn't buy it. In October 2024, after a detailed federal trial in Buffalo, Joseph Bongiovanni was convicted on multiple counts. including accepting bribes, obstruction, and lying to federal agents. The verdict sent ripples through the law enforcement community. At sentencing, the stakes were high. Federal guidelines initially called for a sentence between 19 and 24 years, a severe penalty that reflected the scale of the betrayal. But in October 2025, a judge reviewing the case recommended a significantly reduced range of 9 to 11 years, citing mitigating factors including his prior service and lack of prior convictions. That recommendation didn't erase the gravity of the crimes. It simply underscored how complex the case had become, facing the end of his career and the loss of the very identity he had built over decades. For many in Buffalo, the case was more than just a scandal. It was a reckoning. It exposed how criminal organizations could infiltrate trusted institutions and how loyalty, once broken, could ripple far beyond a single man's actions. The Department of Justice called it a deep betrayal of public trust. U.S. News and World Report highlighted how his actions may have compromised active DEA cases for years. And for the agents who had once worked beside him, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but at a heavy cost. Today, Joseph Bongiovanni remains in federal custody, awaiting his final sentence. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the thin line between authority and corruption, and how even the most experienced agents can fall when they start believing they're untouchable. From the outside, it looked like another win in the war on drugs. But behind the scenes, it revealed something far more unsettling, that sometimes the real threat isn't across the line. It's standing right behind the badge. And that brings us to the next case, one where loyalty took a turn even darker than this. Number 2. James Darrell Hickox.
He pleaded guilty to charges of conspiring to distribute narcotics, conspiring to defraud the United States, and tax evasion. News for Jack's I-Team.
When deputies raided the tidy Florida home of Sergeant James Darrell Hickox, they expected to seize evidence of a small-time theft. What they found instead was a treasure trove of betrayal, boxes of stolen narcotics, firearms, and fake evidence props piled neatly in a garage he proudly called Gator's Man Cave. Before the scandal broke, Hickox was respected, even admired, in Nassau County. A veteran sheriff's sergeant and DEA task force officer, he had spent years in narcotics enforcement, earning a reputation for getting results. Colleagues described him as confident and relentless, someone who seemed to live for the chase. He'd been part of major busts, tracking down traffickers across Florida, and his name carried authority in the department. But behind the badge, another story was unfolding. One that showed how greed can rot even the strongest reputations. The trouble started with missing evidence. Small amounts of seized marijuana and cocaine began disappearing from DEA storage, following operations Hickox had helped lead. At first, no one connected the dots. Drugs occasionally went missing in complex cases, usually explained away by clerical errors or overlapping jurisdictions. But this was different. As months passed, the discrepancies grew larger. What started as a few ounces of unaccounted narcotics became multiple kilograms. And the same officer's name kept appearing in the paperwork. Behind the scenes, Hickox was allegedly running a personal side business, one built on stolen evidence. Prosecutors later revealed that he routinely stole drugs seized during DEA operations, then resold them for profit. Over time, the total value of what he took reached more than $420,000. His scheme was disturbingly methodical. Hickox used his access to DEA evidence lockers to remove packages of narcotics under the guise of administrative checks. He'd then replace the real drugs with fake versions, convincing replicas designed to fool casual inspection. In one case, he reportedly swapped out a kilogram of cocaine with a 3D printed brick, dusted with a thin layer of real powder to make it look authentic. To anyone opening the evidence bag, it appeared untouched. The deception unraveled in 2023 when another officer noticed irregularities in the weight of seized narcotics from a recent raid. An internal review followed, and the inconsistencies pointed straight to Hickox. Federal investigators obtained a warrant and searched his home. What they found read like a crime scene out of irony. Multiple bags of stolen cocaine, marijuana, and prescription drugs, all labeled and stored with meticulous care. There were also stolen firearms, including several taken from past evidence inventories. The drugs were discovered in his garage, next to neon bar signs and a refrigerator full of beer, the same space he had dubbed Gator's Man Cave. But investigators quickly pieced together the full story. They found text messages, sales records, and bank transfers, showing a pattern of illegal transactions stretching over years. The news sent shockwaves through the Nassau County Sheriff's Office and the DEA alike. To the public, it felt like déjà vu. Another law enforcement officer turning criminal, another uniform tainted by greed. Using the trust of his colleagues to mask his crimes. The defense tried to argue that the drugs were mishandled evidence, not proof of ongoing sales. But jurors were unconvinced. The visual evidence, the fake cocaine bricks, the firearms, the labeled bags, spoke louder than any testimony. In January 2025, Hickox was sentenced to 17 years in federal prison. The judge called it a gross abuse of authority and a stain on the badge. The DEA and Nassau County Sheriff's Office issued public statements distancing themselves from him, promising tighter controls on evidence handling. Hickox, once a trusted officer leading drug busts, was now behind bars. A cautionary tale of how absolute access can corrupt absolutely. In prison, he's just another inmate serving time for crimes he once arrested others for. The irony is heavy. The same laws he enforced now define his life. His house was seized, his career destroyed, and his so-called man cave turned into a symbol of his downfall. For investigators, the case remains a reminder of how internal corruption can quietly undermine the justice system. For the community, it's a betrayal that's hard to forget. A man who once promised to clean up the streets instead filled them himself. As U.S. News and World Report summarized, Hickox's case was a double life unraveling brick by brick, literally. And Gizmodo, which covered the strange details of his fake cocaine swaps, called it one of the most bizarre acts of deception by a federal task force officer in years. The DEA, still reeling from recent corruption scandals, vowed to strengthen oversight. But the question lingers. How many others like him slip through before getting caught? Now serving his sentence, James Darrell Hickox has traded the uniform for a jumpsuit, and the authority he once wielded is gone for good. What remains is the lesson his case left behind, that when those entrusted with justice decide to profit from it, the damage runs far deeper than money can measure. And that leads us to the next story. One where the mask of respectability hides something even darker underneath. Number 3. John Costanzo Jr. and Manuel Manny Recio. It began with a whisper through Miami's law enforcement circles, a rumor that two former DEA insiders were quietly selling access to the one thing no defense attorney should ever have, the agency's secrets. By the time investigators confirmed it, the scandal would reach from federal courtrooms to luxury condos and expose a breach of integrity at the highest levels of the DEA's Miami office. For years, John Costanzo Jr. and Manuel Manny Recio were respected figures in federal narcotics enforcement. Costanzo, a second-generation DEA agent, had followed in his father's footsteps. He was known as a sharp, ambitious supervisor who had spent years chasing traffickers across the Caribbean and South Florida. Recio was even more senior, a former assistant special agent in charge who'd retired in 2018 after decades with the agency. Colleagues described him as old school, disciplined, authoritative, someone who seemed to live and breathe DEA protocol. Together, they represented decades of experience and a lifetime of trust. But once Recio stepped into the private sector, that trust began to unravel. After retiring, Recio launched a new career as a private investigator for Miami defense attorneys, the very people who often squared off against the DEA in court. To most, it looked like a standard post-retirement move, an ex-agent using his expertise to assist in criminal defense work. But behind the scenes, prosecutors say Recio was doing more than investigating. He was buying information. Between 2018 and 2020, Recio allegedly reached out to his former colleague, John Costanzo Jr., who was still inside the DEA. He wanted names, case updates, and the kind of sensitive details that could help defense lawyers outmaneuver prosecutors. And Costanzo obliged, for a price. According to federal prosecutors, Costanzo used his badge to query confidential DEA databases, pulling up details about active investigations, upcoming arrests, and surveillance targets. Among those cases was one involving Venezuelan businessman Alex Saab, a politically sensitive investigation with international implications. Recio allegedly funneled $73,000 in bribes to Costanzo through sham invoices and intermediaries, including Costanzo's father, himself a retired DEA agent, who unknowingly helped pass along the payments. The scheme was masked as consulting work and research fees, but the money told a different story. In exchange, Recio provided Costanzo with plane tickets, luxury travel perks, and even a $50,000 down payment on a condominium in Coral Gables. It wasn't just greed, it was a systematic monetization of insider knowledge. Each query, each favor came with a price tag. The conspiracy unraveled in 2021 when auditors at the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General noticed irregular access patterns in DEA databases. Certain names were being searched without corresponding casework, a major red flag. Tracing the logins led straight to Costanzo. When investigators dug deeper, they found encrypted messages, false billing records, and a money trail connecting him to Recio's investigative business. It wasn't long before both men were confronted with evidence that their quiet arrangement had turned into a full-fledged federal case. The arrests in Miami sent shockwaves through the DEA. 2 supervisors, one active, one retired, accused of betraying the agency for bribes. The optics alone were devastating. At trial held in November 2023, prosecutors from the Southern District of New York laid out a narrative of calculated corruption. They argued that Costanzo and Recio had turned a career of law enforcement into a side business, trading secrets for luxury and cash. They had, as one prosecutor put it, put a price tag on the DEA. The defense countered that the payments were legitimate consulting fees, not bribes, and that any database lookups were routine. But the jury wasn't convinced. The digital records, time-stamped queries, and financial transfers told a story that no explanation could undo. In the end, both men were convicted of bribery and honest services wire fraud. The verdict came down hard. In April 2024, John Costanzo Jr. was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, while Manuel "Manny" Recio received 3 years the following month. In court, the judge condemned their actions as a betrayal of public trust for personal gain. Costanzo, once seen as a rising star within the DEA, stood silent as prosecutors detailed how he'd used his access to manipulate ongoing investigations for cash and perks. As NBC New York reported, both men's downfall illustrated how friendship and access became a currency of corruption. Yahoo News detailed the lavish benefits Costanzo received, while U.S. News and World Report emphasized the long-term damage to the DEA's internal credibility. Together, the pair had transformed decades of public service into a black market information exchange. Power without integrity is just opportunity waiting to be abused. Their story ends not in the field, but behind bars, stripped of the badges that once defined them. And that brings us to the next case, one that proves corruption doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it walks among the people who trust it most. Number 4. Nathan Koen. When a man spends years chasing down drug traffickers, you don't expect to find his name on the other side of an indictment. But in Little Rock, Arkansas, that's exactly what happened. For former DEA supervisory agent Nathan Koen, the fall from federal authority to convicted felon, Koen had built his career around enforcing the law. For years, he worked as a trusted DEA agent, part of a team responsible for dismantling major drug operations across the South. He was polished, respected, and known for his calm under pressure, the kind of agent other officers turned to when cases got complicated. He climbed the ranks quickly, eventually becoming a supervisory agent overseeing complex investigations. But behind that professionalism, prosecutors would later say, was a man quietly profiting from the very crimes he was sworn to stop. It began with a trafficker, a drug kingpin who understood that information was as valuable as product. Federal investigators say Koen entered into an arrangement that blurred the line between cop and criminal. In exchange for cash bribes, he provided what the trafficker called top cover protection. That meant advice, warnings, and inside knowledge. When not to use the mail, when to change phone numbers, and when DEA investigations were heating up. For years, Koen had the inside scoop on who was being watched, and he sold that advantage to the highest bidder. The payments came in steady bursts, sometimes as much as $9,000 at a time, passed in cash. And like many corruption stories, it worked for a while. The traffickers stayed ahead of the law, avoiding raids and stings that would have taken down an ordinary operation. But the secrecy didn't last. By 2018, the Department of Justice and Internal Revenue Service began noticing strange patterns in Koen's finances. His official salary couldn't explain his growing wealth, not the expensive trips, not the sudden cash infusions into his accounts. At first, suspicions were quiet. Then came the tip. A confidential informant revealed that a high-level trafficker in the region was bragging about having a man inside the DEA. That name, whispered once, set off a full-scale internal investigation. Agents moved carefully. They surveilled Koen's communications, reviewed his financial records, and began cross-checking every operation he'd been part of. It wasn't long before they found alarming overlaps. Each time Koen was assigned to a case, the suspects seemed to vanish or change tactics days before a raid. Coincidence? The evidence said otherwise. In late 2019, agents confronted him. It was a quiet arrest, the kind meant to minimize public spectacle. But word spread quickly through the DEA offices. One of their own, a supervisor, was accused of taking thousands in bribes to protect a drug trafficker's network. The charges were serious: bribery of a public official and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors alleged that Koen had traded confidential case intelligence for envelopes of cash, repeatedly warning his criminal contact about investigative activity. At trial, federal attorneys detailed how Koen used his position to shield traffickers from surveillance and raids, even coaching them on how to stay invisible. They showed evidence of repeated payments, coded communications, and financial records that didn't match his government salary. In May 2022, Koen stood in federal court to hear his sentence: 11 years and 3 months in prison. The judge described his actions as a calculated betrayal of his oath. The DEA issued a formal statement condemning the corruption, noting that Koen had endangered the very mission of public safety. It was one of the harshest sentences handed down to a DEA agent in recent years. A message that no rank or reputation would shield someone from accountability. Koen was stripped of his badge, pension, and honors. For colleagues who had once respected him, the revelation was devastating. Some had worked cases he'd quietly sabotaged. Others had trusted him with intelligence, now believed to be compromised. In the end, it wasn't an outside criminal network that exposed Nathan Koen. It was the system he thought he'd mastered. The same agencies he once led turned their investigative tools on him, tracing every dollar and every conversation until the truth surfaced. As the Department of Justice later summarized, his scheme represented a direct attack on the integrity of law enforcement. The IRS investigators who traced the illicit payments called it a textbook case of greed overwhelming duty. Today, Koen serves his sentence in federal prison, 11 years to think about the choices that turned a promising career into a cautionary tale. For the DEA, the scars remain. Each conviction like his deepens the challenge of rebuilding public trust. From the outside, Koen's story reads like a paradox. A man who fought the drug war by day and fueled it by night. And when it all came crashing down, it reminded the country that corruption doesn't always look like a villain in the shadows. Sometimes it looks like the agent in charge. And that leads us to the next story, where loyalty, greed, and power collide in a way even more shocking than this one. Number 5. Jose Irizarry. It started like something out of a crime thriller. A DEA agent working undercover in Latin America, chasing cartel money through the shadows of the global drug trade. But in this story, the twist was that the agent himself had joined the game. By the time the investigation ended, Jose Irizarry had become the face of one of the largest corruption scandals in DEA history. A man who not only betrayed his badge, but also helped traffickers launder millions while living a life of yachts, jewels, and lies. Irizarry joined the Drug Enforcement Administration with all the right credentials. Smart, bilingual, and charismatic, he quickly climbed the ranks, landing assignments that took him deep into the world of international narcotics finance. From Miami to Bogota, he was known as a go-getter, the kind of agent who could move millions through undercover accounts without flinching. His job was to help the DEA trace drug money, to follow the dollars, not the drugs. It was a world of wire transfers, shell companies, and coded transactions. But what colleagues didn't see was that Irizarry had stopped tracing the money and started keeping it. Around 2010, while stationed in Colombia, Irizarry began quietly diverting DEA funds from undercover operations. Working with criminal associates and corrupt financial contacts, he stole roughly $9 million meant to dismantle trafficking networks, and instead funneled it into his own accounts. Prosecutors later said Irizarry conspired with Colombian cartels to skim money from DEA sting operations. These were funds that were supposed to be seized and traced, but Irizarry and his partners rerouted them through a maze of secret accounts, keeping their share as they went. The more money he moved, the bolder he became. He started living like the very traffickers he was supposed to be taking down. Luxury cars, expensive Tiffany jewelry, and yacht parties along the Caribbean coast. He and his wife bought homes, traveled first class, and threw lavish celebrations that seemed impossible on a government salary. To outsiders, it looked like a successful agent enjoying the perks of overseas service. But to investigators, the numbers stopped adding up. The first red flags came from within. A DEA accountant reviewing Irizarry's financial transactions noticed unreported expenses tied to overseas transfers. At first, it seemed like sloppy bookkeeping. Then, in 2018, an informant came forward, a Colombian money launderer who claimed one of his biggest clients was a U.S. agent. That confession blew the case wide open. Investigators from the Department of Justice and Internal Affairs followed the trail through international accounts, tracing millions in diverted funds. What they uncovered was staggering. Irizarry had built an entire shadow network, using DEA undercover operations as a cover for his own laundering scheme. In 2020, Irizarry was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit money laundering and bank fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. There were fake business fronts, falsified records, and emails describing payments disguised as consulting fees. He pleaded guilty, admitting to his role in helping cartels wash millions in drug proceeds. The plea deal detailed how he and his associates exploited the DEA's undercover infrastructure, moving money meant for law enforcement back into criminal hands and into his own. At sentencing, prosecutors said Irizarry had corrupted one of the most powerful tools in federal law enforcement for personal gain. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was institutional. In December 2021, a federal judge sentenced Jose Irizarry to 12 years in prison. The courtroom was tense as the judge delivered scathing remarks not only about Irizarry, but about the DEA itself. According to CBS News, the judge said the case exposed systemic failures within the agency, failures that allowed Irizarry to operate unchecked for years. He expressed open disgust at how easily Irizarry and his circle had manipulated the system, noting that other agents, tempted by the allure of easy money, might have also crossed the line. NBC News reported that Irizarry apologized in court, admitting that he had lost his moral compass and had been seduced by the lifestyle. But the damage was done to his career, his family, and the agency's reputation. For the DEA, the scandal was a public humiliation. Irizarry's case became a symbol of how weak oversight could turn federal operations into criminal opportunities. The agency launched internal reforms, vowing to track financial transfers more closely and audit agents with access to undercover funds. But inside the ranks, trust had been shattered. Agents who once prided themselves on their integrity now faced public skepticism, questions about whether the DEA could police itself. Behind bars, Irizarry's story serves as a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. He had built a life that mirrored the very criminals he hunted: fast cars, luxury jewelry, and the illusion of control. But in the end, the same system he exploited brought him down. When the money ran out, all that remained was the truth. A lawman who became the thing he swore to fight. As one federal official put it, Irizarry didn't just steal from the DEA, he stole from every honest agent who still believes in the badge. Now serving his 12-year sentence, Jose Irizarry represents the cost of unchecked power and the danger of believing you can play both sides of the law. And that brings us to the next case, where the pursuit of power turns into something even more dangerous than money. Number 6. Chad Scott, the White Devil. In the Louisiana Bayou, they called him the White Devil. Among drug traffickers, that name carried fear, a DEA agent whose reputation for toughness bordered on myth. But for Chad Scott, the truth behind that legend was darker than anyone imagined. The same man who once stormed into dealers' homes with a badge and a gun would one day find himself in handcuffs, convicted of stealing, lying, and throwing evidence into the swamp to cover his tracks. For more than 2 decades, Chad Scott built his name as one of the DEA's most relentless agents. Based out of New Orleans, he had a reputation for getting results. High-value arrests, major busts, and aggressive tactics that drew both praise and criticism. To his peers, he was fearless. To the people he chased, he was ruthless. He worked long hours, led joint task forces, and seemed to thrive on the chaos of narcotics enforcement. But beneath that tough image, Scott had grown consumed by ego and greed, a desire not just to win cases, but to own the game. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Scott's corruption ran deep. Over the years, he stole cash from suspects, falsified official reports, and even committed perjury to protect himself. It began small, a few $100s here and there after a raid. But the temptation grew. Soon, he was manipulating evidence logs, rewriting reports, and pocketing drug money that should have gone into evidence. One of the most brazen acts came when Scott helped orchestrate the theft of a Ford F-150 truck from a suspect. He falsified the paperwork, claimed it as a seizure for official use, and drove it himself. To those around him, it was just another vehicle in the task force fleet. But the fraud was sitting in plain sight. The real unraveling began when whispers of his misconduct reached federal ears. Internal investigators noticed irregularities in his paperwork, missing evidence, questionable testimony, and false case narratives. When confronted, Scott doubled down, insisting he was being targeted for his aggressive style. But the walls were closing in. In 2016, federal agents launched a full-scale investigation. Witnesses began coming forward, including former colleagues and informants who said Scott had crossed lines for years. The turning point came when he learned he was under investigation. Instead of cooperating, he tried to destroy evidence. Prosecutors later revealed that Scott and others dumped boxes of evidence into the swamps outside New Orleans, hoping the murky water would erase the truth. It didn't. The evidence of his corruption was overwhelming. By 2019, Scott was indicted on a series of charges, including theft, falsification of government records, obstruction of justice, and perjury. During the trial, prosecutors described a man intoxicated by power, someone who saw himself as untouchable. They detailed how he'd coerced others to lie on his behalf and manipulated official testimony to cover his tracks. Witnesses described how Scott had instructed them to give false statements to federal grand juries. Others recalled his arrogance, his belief that his results excused his misconduct. He had once been one of the DEA's top agents. Now he was its cautionary tale. In August 2021, after a long and bitter legal battle, Chad Scott was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. The verdict closed the chapter on a case that had haunted the DEA's Gulf Coast Division for years. The judge called his actions a betrayal of every honest law enforcement officer in the country. Local outlets like Fox 8 Live and NOLA.com covered the sentencing extensively, noting how prosecutors had portrayed him as a predator in a badge, a man who used his authority to enrich himself and destroy evidence when cornered. The nickname White Devil, once spoken in fear by drug traffickers, took on a bitter irony. He had become the very evil he claimed to fight. Even after the conviction, the fallout continued. The U.S. Department of Justice launched internal reviews into his old cases, questioning whether other agents had followed his lead or looked the other way. Some of the convictions he'd secured were re-examined. For the DEA, the damage was profound. Scott's case revealed not just a single bad actor, but a culture where unchecked power had allowed corruption to take root. His downfall also reignited public scrutiny of law enforcement in Louisiana, where rough tactics had long been tolerated as the price of results. As one former colleague told the Hammond Star, everyone thought he was unstoppable. Turns out, he was just another crook with a badge. Now, from a prison cell far from the swamps where he once dumped evidence, Chad Scott serves out his 13-year sentence. His career, once defined by high-profile arrests, now stands as a warning of how absolute authority can twist into absolute corruption. To the communities he policed, he was the White Devil. To the justice system, he became something far worse. Proof that when a lawman loses his integrity, he doesn't just break the law, he breaks faith with everyone who ever believed in it. And that brings us to the next story, where the pursuit of justice takes another devastating turn, blurring the line between the hunter and the hunted. Number 7. Johnny Domingue. He was supposed to be a witness for the government, a man who had already fallen from grace but was trying to rebuild it by helping bring down his former boss. But before long, Johnny Domingue went from key witness to repeat offender, proving that some people don't just cross the line once, they make a career of it. Domingue's story began like many others in law enforcement. A native of Louisiana, he built his career as a DEA task force officer, working alongside federal agents to take down the same drug networks that plagued his own community. He was sharp, ambitious, and trusted. He had what looked like a promising future in the fight against narcotics. But beneath the surface, temptation was brewing. Working cases that dealt with thousands in seized cash and kilos of narcotics, Domingue saw firsthand how easy it was to make money disappear, and how hard it was to trace. By 2016, those temptations became actions. Prosecutors later revealed that Domingue misappropriated DEA funds and even kept cocaine from evidence for personal use. It was a double betrayal, stealing from the agency and using the very drugs he was supposed to be taking off the streets. The scandal exploded as part of a wider investigation into DEA corruption in Louisiana, an investigation that would later ensnare his supervisor, Chad Scott, the so-called White Devil. Domingue's crimes might have remained hidden, but Scott's growing legal trouble dragged everything into the light. When investigators turned their attention to the task force, Domingue's name came up again and again, tied to missing evidence, unaccounted cash, and unfiled reports. Faced with overwhelming proof, he had no choice but to cooperate. Domingue pleaded guilty to possession of cocaine and misappropriating DEA funds. He took the stand against his former mentor, Chad Scott, and testified about the culture of misconduct that had infected their unit. He told prosecutors how Scott encouraged falsified paperwork, manipulated informants, and treated DEA operations as personal enterprises. His testimony helped solidify Scott's conviction and expose just how deep the corruption had gone inside the agency's New Orleans division. When sentencing came, the court took his cooperation into account. In 2018, Domingue was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison, a relatively light punishment considering the crimes. The message was clear: testify truthfully and you get a second chance. And for a moment, it seemed like he might take it. After serving his time, he walked out of prison with the chance to start over. But that redemption arc didn't last long. In September 2020, barely months after his release, Domingue was arrested again, this time in Texas. The charge: trafficking more than 17 pounds of cocaine. Authorities said he was stopped during a highway interdiction, and officers discovered the drugs hidden in his vehicle. What shocked investigators most wasn't just the quantity, it was who they were dealing with. A former DEA task force officer, once entrusted to enforce the law, was now allegedly smuggling the very product he used to seize. According to the Hammond Star and NOLA.com, federal prosecutors were stunned. Domingue's cooperation in the Chad Scott case had been critical. Now, his relapse into criminal behavior threatened to undermine everything he had testified to. The arrest also reignited public outrage. If a former officer could serve prison time, walk free, and immediately fall back into trafficking, what did that say about the culture inside the agency that once employed him? At the time of his second arrest, Domingue faced 10 years to life in prison if convicted. The irony was inescapable. The man who had testified about corruption and greed had stepped right back into it. Federal authorities expressed deep frustration. One official, quoted by local media, said it was as if he learned nothing except how to hide it better. The DEA distanced itself from him completely, emphasizing that he was no longer connected to the agency and that his conduct was a personal failure, not a reflection of the agency's mission. But for the public, the damage was done. Domingue's case became another entry in the growing list of former agents and task force officers who had succumbed to the lure of easy money. When the story broke, the Hammond Star captured the irony best. He helped expose corruption, only to return to it. For a brief time, Domingue had the chance to prove that accountability could lead to redemption. Instead, he proved that some patterns are harder to break than prison bars. Today, Johnny Domingue sits in custody, his legal future uncertain, but his reputation permanently destroyed. He once stood in court as a key witness for the United States government. Now he faces the government's full weight once again, this time as a repeat offender. His story isn't just about greed, it's about addiction to power, to risk, to the thrill of control. And in the end, it's a reminder that justice isn't always clean. Sometimes it comes from the same people who tried hardest to escape it. Number 8. Fernando Gomez, the DEA double agent. In the shadows of Chicago's drug war, one man managed to play both sides of the law. By day, Fernando Gomez wore a DEA badge. By night, he was helping the very traffickers he was sworn to destroy. His double life would take nearly a decade to unravel. A story of loyalty twisted by greed, and of a federal agent who became the enemy within. Before he ever joined the DEA, Gomez's resume read like that of a model public servant. He was a former U.S. Marine, disciplined and patriotic, the kind of man who seemed built for law enforcement. After his military service, he joined the Evanston Police Department in Illinois, earning praise for his professionalism and calm under pressure. When he joined the Drug Enforcement Administration in 2011, it seemed like a natural step. Colleagues saw him as a rising star, a local cop turned federal agent with military grit and street smarts. But behind that facade, Gomez was hiding a secret that would take years to surface. He wasn't just joining the DEA to fight drug traffickers, he was joining to protect them. According to prosecutors, Gomez was already tied to La Organización de Narcotraficantes Unidos, a powerful cocaine trafficking ring that operated between Puerto Rico, Chicago, and the East Coast. Once inside the DEA, he used his position to act as a mole for the organization, leaking sensitive information and guiding them away from danger. He provided insider knowledge when investigations were active, which routes were under surveillance, and which informants might be compromised. It was the kind of information that could save traffickers millions and cost lives in the process. But Gomez didn't stop there. Investigators say he also sold firearms to members of the drug ring, weapons that were later used to protect their cocaine shipments. Each transaction deepened his ties to the traffickers and blurred the line between lawman and criminal. The traffickers trusted him completely. But the DEA's world is smaller than it seems, and by 2017, rumors began to circulate among federal investigators that something was off. Arrested traffickers started name-dropping a federal friend who warned them when raids were coming. That was enough to trigger an internal review. When investigators traced certain case leaks and missing evidence trails, they found a pattern that led straight to Gomez. By 2018, the facade began to crumble. A joint task force led by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago and the FBI uncovered communications linking Gomez to known members of La Organización de Narcotraficantes Unidos. Text messages, phone records, and bank deposits painted a picture of betrayal that stretched back years. In 2019, Gomez was arrested and charged with conspiring to distribute cocaine, selling firearms to traffickers, and obstruction of justice. His arrest stunned his colleagues. To many in law enforcement, it was unthinkable. A Marine, a police officer, a DEA agent, now accused of working for the very cartel they fought to dismantle. At trial, prosecutors from the Northern District of Illinois described Gomez's actions as a calculated infiltration of the DEA. They said he joined the agency not out of duty, but out of opportunity, to feed information to traffickers while earning their trust and their cash. Defense attorneys tried to cast him as a man who had lost his way, someone manipulated by dangerous people and trapped in a cycle of fear and control. But the evidence was too strong. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered the sentence, calling his actions a deliberate betrayal of the public trust and the integrity of every honest agent who wears the badge. According to the Chicago Tribune, prosecutors emphasized that Gomez had done more than just accept bribes. He had joined the enemy. His cooperation had allowed traffickers to stay one step ahead of the law, compromising investigations that took years to build. Even as he stood for sentencing, Gomez showed little emotion. The judge told him bluntly, "You didn't just cross the line, you erased it." Today, Fernando Gomez sits in federal custody, serving out his 4-year sentence, a relatively short term for a betrayal that cut deep into the DEA's credibility. When he's released, he'll carry not the rank of a federal agent, but the label of a convicted felon who turned the nation's trust into a weapon. His story is a chilling reminder that even the institutions built to fight corruption can be corrupted from within, and that sometimes the badge doesn't represent justice at all, but the perfect disguise. And that brings us to the next story. One where the mask of authority hides a deception just as shocking, but far from the DEA's reach. Number 9. Carl Force, the Silk Road agent who turned rogue. When the Silk Road case broke, it was hailed as one of the biggest law enforcement victories in cybercrime history. The takedown of a global dark web empire that traded in drugs, weapons, and digital anonymity. But buried beneath that success was a twist no one saw coming. One of the DEA agents investigating the case had secretly joined the other side. That man was Carl Mark Force IV, a decorated 15-year DEA veteran. And by the time the truth came out, his betrayal would stun the agency, the courts, and the world of federal law enforcement. Force had all the hallmarks of a model agent. He was experienced, intelligent, and one of the few in the DEA who understood the complexities of digital currency and the dark web. His colleagues trusted him. His superiors relied on him. In 2012, when the agency formed a task force to investigate the Silk Road, the notorious online marketplace run by the elusive Dread Pirate Roberts, Force was a natural choice. The mission was to dismantle the site and arrest its founder, Ross Ulbricht, whose platform had become the Amazon of illegal goods. But soon after going undercover, Carl Force made a fateful decision, one that would turn the hunter into the hunted. Working under a false persona, Force infiltrated the Silk Road network. His task was to gather intelligence and pose as a drug trafficker to win the trust of the site's founder. But as the undercover work deepened, Force saw another opportunity, a personal one. Instead of just investigating, he began extorting Ulbricht directly. Using one of his online aliases, Knob, Force contacted the Silk Road administrator and offered inside information about the investigation for a price. At the same time, he used another alias, French Maid, to sell law enforcement secrets to the very criminal he was supposed to capture. He offered to leak details about ongoing investigations, and in return, Ulbricht sent payments in Bitcoin. Payments that Force quietly diverted to his own accounts. By the time investigators discovered what he was doing, Force had laundered roughly $300,000 worth of Bitcoin, using offshore exchanges and false invoices to cover his tracks. He also offered to sell fake IDs, tried to invest in Bitcoin startups with stolen funds, and even applied for a job with one of the companies he was supposed to be investigating, while still on the government payroll. But it wasn't just greed, it was arrogance. Force had come to believe he was untouchable, that no one would question the actions of a decorated DEA agent operating in uncharted digital territory. For a while, he got away with it. The Silk Road Task Force continued its work, ultimately leading to Ross Ulbricht's 2013 arrest and life sentence. But when other agencies began auditing the investigation's financial records, cracks began to show. Unexplained Bitcoin transfers were traced back to wallets controlled by Force. Investigators noticed that some of the very accounts Ulbricht had paid were connected to government devices. Then came the discovery that Force had been communicating with Ulbricht privately, outside official channels. It was a betrayal hiding in plain sight. In 2015, the Department of Justice brought the case forward. Prosecutors described his actions as a breathtaking abuse of power. Force had not only stolen money, but had compromised one of the largest cyber investigations in U.S. history. They said he'd turned a landmark case into a personal business venture. At his trial, Force admitted to diverting Bitcoin and lying to investigators. He pleaded guilty, acknowledging that he had used his position for personal enrichment. In October 2015, he was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. According to NBC News, the judge didn't hold back. He called Force's behavior a betrayal of public trust that is quite simply breathtaking. He told Force that his actions had damaged not just a case, but the reputation of the agency he'd once proudly served. The Department of Justice echoed that sentiment in its statement after sentencing, noting that Force's crimes strike at the heart of public confidence in law enforcement. The fallout spread quickly. The Silk Road case, once seen as a clean victory, was now tinged with scandal. It turned out that Force wasn't the only rogue agent involved. A Secret Service agent named Sean Bridges was also later convicted of stealing Bitcoin from the investigation. Together, their corruption cast a long shadow over what should have been a milestone in cybercrime enforcement. For the DEA, the embarrassment was profound. The agency that prided itself on integrity in dangerous undercover operations now faced questions about how two of its agents could manipulate digital evidence and walk away with hundreds of thousands in cryptocurrency. From his prison cell, Force reflected on the irony of it all. He had once been tasked with tracing the flow of dirty money online, and in the end, he became part of that very flow. The man who helped take down the Silk Road had built his own personal version of it, hidden behind the same anonymity he was sworn to dismantle. His fall proved that even in a world built on code, encryption, and surveillance, the oldest motive of all still rules: the lure of easy money. And that brings us to the next story. One where the cost of corruption isn't measured in dollars or Bitcoin, but in lives forever changed. Number 10. Darnell Garcia. The DEA's darkest chapter. In the long history of federal law enforcement, few names carry the same weight of disgrace as Darnell Garcia. His case wasn't just another corruption scandal. It was a collapse from within. As one prosecutor put it, it was the worst corruption scandal in the history of the Drug Enforcement Administration. By the time his crimes came to light, Garcia had gone from decorated DEA agent to convicted trafficker, stealing drugs and money straight out of evidence vaults, and helping move them back onto the streets. Darnell Garcia's story began far from the chaos he would one day create. He joined the DEA in the 1970s, during a time when the war on drugs was at full force. Ambitious, well-spoken, and confident, Garcia climbed through the ranks quickly. He was assigned to the agency's Los Angeles division, one of the busiest in the country, where seizures of cocaine and heroin were daily routine. He was known as a rising star, but beneath that polished image, greed was taking root. By the early 1980s, Garcia had grown frustrated with the limits of a government paycheck. He was handling millions in seized drugs and cash every year, watching traffickers live lives of wealth while he filed the paperwork that put them away. Somewhere along the way, he decided to stop watching and start taking. According to federal prosecutors, Garcia orchestrated one of the largest theft operations ever carried out inside the DEA. Working with two accomplices, also former agents, he began siphoning drugs, cash, and evidence directly from DEA facilities. It started with smaller quantities, cash skimmed from seizure reports and mislabeled narcotics. But as the thefts went unchecked, the crimes grew bolder. Eventually, Garcia and his partners stole more than 400 pounds of cocaine from a DEA stash house, along with over 2 pounds of heroin from a secure evidence vault. They even took nearly $100,000 in cash from DEA offices, money that was supposed to fund undercover operations. Garcia's insider access made it easy. He knew where the evidence was stored, who was on shift, and how to manipulate the tracking systems. When investigators reviewed the logs later, they found false signatures and altered entries designed to erase his tracks. The stolen drugs didn't vanish. They reappeared on the streets. Garcia and his co-conspirators sold the stolen narcotics through intermediaries, funneling the proceeds through a web of money laundering operations that reached from Los Angeles to Mexico. For years, they lived well, cash flowing, connections expanding, and suspicion minimal. But the cracks were inevitable. By the mid-1980s, federal auditors began noticing major discrepancies in drug inventories. Evidence bags that should have been sealed were empty. Seized cocaine had vanished, replaced by filler materials. It was the kind of internal chaos the DEA wasn't used to handling. When the agency launched a quiet internal probe, the trail led back to Garcia's team. And what investigators uncovered was staggering. By 1988, a full federal investigation was underway. Agents traced bank deposits, cross-checked evidence records, and followed Garcia's financial paper trail. What they found was an elaborate scheme built on lies and corruption. When he was finally arrested, the charges were unprecedented: conspiracy, theft, heroin distribution, and money laundering. The same man who had once kicked down doors in drug raids was now accused of running his own criminal enterprise. During the trial, prosecutors painted a portrait of greed gone unchecked. Garcia had used his authority not to uphold the law, but to exploit it. Witnesses testified that he had personally distributed narcotics and pocketed profits, all while still drawing a federal salary. One prosecutor summed it up simply: he turned the DEA into his own cartel. In July 1991, Darnell Garcia was convicted on all major counts and sentenced to 80 years in federal prison, one of the harshest penalties ever handed down to a federal law enforcement officer. The court called his actions a betrayal beyond measure. The sentence wasn't just about punishment. It was meant to send a message that no badge, no title, and no agency stood above the law. As UPI reported at the time, Garcia's case rocked the DEA to its core, exposing vulnerabilities in the agency's evidence handling and oversight systems. Senior officials publicly described the scandal as a turning point, forcing the DEA to reform internal procedures and tighten control over seized property. In prison, Garcia remained defiant for years, insisting he'd been framed by jealous colleagues. But the evidence told a different story, one of systematic theft, manipulation, and greed. He became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when authority goes unchecked. His crimes didn't just stain the agency's reputation, they redefined it. After Garcia, no agent's integrity was taken for granted again. The fall of Darnell Garcia stands as one of the most shocking betrayals in American law enforcement history. A reminder that corruption doesn't always come from outside the system. Sometimes it wears the same badge as everyone else. And that brings us to the next case, one where the hunger for power led not to money or drugs, but to something even more dangerous: